Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most unsettling chapters in European royal history, where a king's seemingly unbreakable reign slowly crumbles under the weight of his own body's betrayal. Imagine, for a moment, you're watching the grand procession of a monarch and emperor in every sense walking through the ornate halls of his castle, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off centuries-old stone walls. But little do the courtiers know, beneath his regal exterior, his body is slowly being ravaged by an invisible, unstoppable force. And no, it's not a war or rebellion that will bring him down, it's something far more personal, far more treacherous. You probably won't survive this tale unscathed, especially when we get to the dark end of this ruler's reign. But don't worry, we'll take it slow, together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post where you're watching from and what time it is there, I'd love to know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins with the birth of a king, Philip II of Spain, a monarch whose reign would eventually stretch over vast parts of Europe, the Americas, and the Philippines. Born in 1527, Philip was destined for greatness, or so it seemed. The son of the mighty Emperor Charles V, Philip was moulded for leadership from an early age. His father, who ruled over an empire so vast it was famously said that the sun never set on it, set an enormous precedent for young Philip, and like his father, who had inherited a blend of territories through various alliances and wars, Philip would forge his own way. His early years were marked by an education that emphasised diplomacy, warfare, and the Catholic faith. And though he was often seen as the ideal, pious king, history would later question whether his obsession with control and order traits that he learned from his father could eventually unravel his rule. He was, by all accounts, a man of intense devotion. Philip took his faith seriously, and his Catholicism shaped his decisions as much as his political ambitions. He was known for his meticulous nature, ensuring that every part of his empire fell under his scrutiny. From Spain to the Netherlands, from Italy to the Americas, Philip held his territories with a tight grip. It wasn't just the territories, though it was the people. He believed that his divine right to rule was given by God, and he would stop at nothing to keep his lands under control. But Philip was no stranger to conflict. Whether it was suppressing revolts, dealing with rebellious Protestant forces in the Netherlands, or attempting to subjugate England with the infamous Spanish Armada, his reign was one of constant tension both politically and personally. As we move deeper into this story, we'll begin to see how these pressures, coupled with his own personal demons, would twist the legacy of a king who started out with seemingly unshakable authority. As Philip II's reign deepened, so did the cracks in the facade of his perfect, pious monarchy. You might picture him now a king locked in a battle not just for control over his empire, but over something far more insidious and ultimately destructive. Behind his stoic face and unyielding rule, his personal life was far from the tidy image he wanted to project. It was during these years of political pressure and isolation that Philip found himself tangled in an affair with the most dangerous of adversaries, his own body. Historians still argue whether Philip's slow decline was purely due to syphilis, or a mixture of physical ailments and psychological stresses, but let's be honest, syphilis was not a disease of high society that could be swept under the rug. It was the kind of thing that would eat away at a man's body, and in Philip's case, his mind too. The disease took root in his body sometime around 1562 following a marriage that, on the surface, was politically advantageous but personally disastrous. Philip had married Elizabeth of Valois, the daughter of the French king, hoping to cement a strong alliance with France. But the marriage brought with it not only political intrigue but also betrayal. Historians are still divided on whether Elizabeth passed the disease on to Philip or if he had already contracted it through earlier. More clandestine affairs. What we do know is that by the time Elizabeth died in 1568, Philip's physical health was deteriorating. He became pale and gaunt, his skin marked with sores that worsened over time. His limbs stiffened, his vision blurred. By the late 1570s, the king's once regal appearance was marred by these telltale signs of syphilis. You might be wondering what it was like for Philip to try to hold on to his empire while his body betrayed him. Well, imagine being the most powerful man in the world, reigning over an empire that spanned continents, and suddenly feeling trapped inside your own body, unable to control what's happening to you. As the disease ravaged his body, it also ravaged his ability to govern. Philip had always been a micromanager and keen to oversee every detail of his kingdom, but the toll of syphilis began to make his once legendary work ethic slip. At the same time, his mind began to falter, and his already strained relationships with his family began to unravel. He became obsessed with maintaining control, pushing away his closest advisors, unable to trust anyone. By the late 1570s, Philip, in his weakened state, increasingly relied on his son, Don Felipe, to manage the day-to-day affairs of the empire. But Don Felipe's failures only heightened his father's paranoia and distrust. Philip would give cryptic orders, sometimes baffling his ministers with the irrationality of his requests, all the while retreating into his chambers where the syphilis continued to gnaw away at him. This, of course, didn't go unnoticed. His court began to whisper. Philip, who had once been so authoritative, now seemed increasingly delusional. His temper became more erratic, and his mood swings more pronounced. He would lock himself away for days, speaking little, only emerging to give strange, disconnected orders. And with the unravelling of his mind came the unravelling of his empire. The Spanish Armada, which he had so confidently sent to invade England in 1588, ended in disastrous failure. And historians argue whether Philip's physical and mental decline played a part in his disastrous miscalculations. The once invincible king now seemed vulnerable, both to external threats and to the invisible sickness that slowly consumed him. The disease wasn't just ruining Philip's body, it was also warping his decisions, his leadership, and his ability to connect with the people who once revered him. As you imagine the fall of this once mighty ruler, it's hard not to think of the tragic irony a king who had conquered so much could not conquer the disease inside him, nor the isolation it brought. His enemies across the world might have feared his armies, but no one could have predicted that his greatest foe would be something as mundane and yet as insidious as a disease that had plagued humanity for centuries. As Philip II's health spiralled, so too did the strength of his empire. The once powerful king, who had held dominion over vast lands from the Netherlands to the Americas, now seemed like a mere shadow of himself. His illness, which had begun subtly, now took a firm grip on his body and mind. You can almost imagine the vast, dark chambers of the El Escorial, his royal palace, where the king spent his final years. Slipping further and further into madness, his once sharp eyes were clouded with sickness, and his posture, once so proud, had become hunched, weakened by the ravages of syphilis. By the late 1580s, Philip was barely able to govern. His diminishing health led to his increasing isolation, and he began to retreat even further from the outside world. His court, once a bustling centre of politics, now felt more like a ghost town. Ministers, generals, and advisors still looked to him for leadership, but they often found only a broken, distracted man who no longer held the reins of power. His son, Don Felipe, was left to handle much of the administrative burdens. But even he couldn't fill the enormous shoes of his father. The disease, in its final stages, had begun to destroy Philip's mental faculties. His paranoia reached new heights, and his once unshakable sense of divine right became almost delusional. Historians still debate whether Philip's obsession with controlling every aspect of his kingdom was a symptom of his illness, or whether it had always been a part of his nature. Either way, his deteriorating mental state only worsened the internal conflicts within Spain. By the time Philip entered the final years of his life, his empire was showing signs of collapse, with revolts in the Netherlands, political instability in France, and the looming presence of a hostile England. But perhaps the most striking element of Philip's decline was the personal toll it took on him. His health deteriorated so rapidly that even those closest to him began to question his capacity for leadership. His relationships with his family, especially with his son, were strained. Don Felipe, whom he had groomed to take over his empire, was not up to the task. As Philip's mind deteriorated, he saw conspiracies everywhere. He turned against his own advisors, suspecting them of betrayal. There was a growing sense of fear within his court. The once dominant king, who had been seen as an indomitable force, was now a frail, broken man unable to hold on to the power he had fought so hard to maintain. The court began to fracture as well. One of the most significant moments in the latter part of Philip's reign came when he began to distance himself from his closest allies and even his children. He had once been a father who ruled with an iron fist, but now he was alone, his illness taking him further away from the world he once commanded. His paranoia and fear of betrayal made it difficult for him to trust even his family. And the bonds that had once tied him to his kingdom now seemed weak and frail. Yet, despite his physical and mental decline, Philip clung to the idea of absolute control. He continued to issue commands from his sickbed, sometimes issuing contradictory orders or losing track of his own directives. His ministers were left scrambling to make sense of his demands, and his empire, once tightly controlled, now seemed to be on the brink of unraveling. While his health worsened, so too did his personal life. The disease, which had affected his body for years, finally began to take a toll on his mind. His relationships with his family grew strained, particularly with his children, who were caught in the turmoil of his mental and physical decline. Historians often describe Philip's final years as a time of intense solitude and paranoia. He had once been surrounded by advisors and servants, but by the end of his life, he had pushed everyone away, unable to trust even those closest to him. Philip II's life was marked by a relentless pursuit of control over his empire, his people, and his own fate. But in the end, syphilis proved to be the one thing he couldn't control. It ravaged not only his body but his mind, unraveling the very fabric of his reign. And as his mental state deteriorated, so did his empire. The once unified Spain was now fractured, with rebellions and uprisings threatening the very core of his rule. His reign, once marked by ambition and strength, was now tainted by the crippling effects of disease and isolation. As the king's physical decline worsened, so did his legacy. While historians still debate the extent of syphilis's impact on his decision-making, it is undeniable that the disease played a significant role in the unraveling of his reign. The mighty king, who had once commanded armies and empires, was now a broken man, his empire slipping away from his grasp, piece by piece. As Philip II's body began to shut down, so did his empire. His final years, consumed by the ravages of syphilis and his increasingly fragile mental state, saw Spain teeter on the edge of disarray. Philip, once the proud monarch of an empire upon which the sun never set, now found himself increasingly irrelevant. His reign, once marked by military might and an unwavering grip on power, slowly unravelled in his final years as the disease eroded his faculties. But in his death, as in life, Philip left behind an undeniable legacy. His story doesn't end with just the fading echoes of a broken king, it lingers in the decline of an empire that never fully recovered from his absence. When Philip II died in 1598, his death was a sombre and telling end to an era. His son, Philip III, took the throne, but the transition wasn't seamless. The immense weight of Philip II's ambitions and his grand vision for Spain had left an empire that was overstretched, its resources drained, and its people disillusioned. The seeds of revolt had already been planted by Philip's inability to truly manage his empire during the latter years of his reign. Historians have long debated the influence of his personal health on these events. Was his mental and physical decline responsible for Spain's inability to hold on to its global dominance? Or was the empire's eventual collapse simply a natural consequence of imperial overstretch? What is clear, however, is that the syphilis which plagued Philip during his final years left its mark on both his body and his legacy. His inability to maintain control over his kingdom during his illness and the subsequent collapse of Spain's supremacy was a stark illustration of how a ruler's personal decline can mirror that of the state itself. You can almost imagine the world beyond the palace walls, where rival nations England, France, and the burgeoning Dutch Republic sensed the weakness in Spain and began to take advantage of it. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, a catastrophic failure, was one of the most humiliating events in Philip's reign. It is often seen as a harbinger of the eventual decline of Spanish power in Europe. But Philip's syphilis was not just a personal affliction, it was a metaphor for the creeping rot that began to infect his empire. As his mind failed, so too did his vision. Once resolute and relentless, Philip was now a man barely clinging to control, desperately trying to maintain his grip on his crumbling empire. In the years following his death, Spain's wealth continued to wane, its military prowess faded, and its once dominant position on the global stage began to fade into the background. The empire that Philip II had built began to splinter, and Spain would never again hold the same kind of power it once had. Historians still argue about the true legacy of Philip II. Was he a tragic figure, a king undone by his health? A man whose empire fell because of his personal decline? Or was he simply a monarch whose time had passed, whose empire could not withstand the test of time? What cannot be disputed is that Philip II's death marked the end of an era. And the disease that ravaged him, syphilis, was just one piece of the puzzle. Even after his death, the mystery surrounding Philip's illness and his final days continued to intrigue historians and scholars. The question of whether syphilis played a central role in his mental and physical deterioration is still debated today. Some argue that the disease did not significantly impact his leadership, while others believe it was the key factor in his decline. Either way, it is undeniable that his health, both mental and physical, played a crucial role in the weakening of Spain. Yet it is sure. The influence of Philip II's reign continued to be felt long after his death. His commitment to Catholicism, his drive for imperial expansion, and his desire for absolute control left an indelible mark on Spain and Europe. The Spanish Inquisition, which Philip supported, continued to haunt the country for generations, and his attempts to suppress Protestantism were remembered as a dark chapter in religious history. In the end, the death of Philip II was not just the death of a king, but the end of an era of Spanish dominance. The empire he built, which had stretched so far across the globe, began to unravel in the years that followed. While Philip's disease may have hastened the decline, it was the shifting tides of history that ultimately brought down the empire. So, as we conclude this dark journey through Philip II's life, it's worth reflecting on the tragic irony of a king who had once been invincible. A ruler who believed that his reign could never falter, was undone by the very fragility of his body. In the end, it wasn't external enemies that brought down Philip II. It was his own deteriorating health, his mind slowly being consumed by the ravages of syphilis, that led to his downfall. and with his death. The empire he'd worked so hard to build began to fade away, leaving behind only echoes of what had once been, now, as the story of Philip II fades into history. It's a sobering reminder that no matter how powerful a ruler may be, they are ultimately at the mercy of forces beyond their control. And for Philip, that force was a disease that, much like his reign, seemed unstoppable until it finally consumed him. The dark end of the Spanish king who died of syphilis serves as a cautionary tale, one where the limits of human strength and control are exposed for all to see.